I mean, I think I am very fortunate. I often say to people when I'm talking to young people, I said, you could have a life 50% as good as mine, you'd be very happy. You know, I mean, I've had I think Bob knows me longer than probably anybody here, but I think you have to be lucky, but I think I never changed from who I was. In the early going, I remember being trained in Sinesta. They had training programs, management training programs. And one of the groups I went to, which was in 62 or 3, was what they call a T group. And there was a T group. It's a group like this they put together. And we sat in a room, and they had people from every function in the hotel: accounting, sales, food and beverage, rooms, engineering, everything. They had different, not in the same hotel, but from around the company. And they sat there with a consultant for a couple hours, and nobody said anything because they didn't know what they were there for. It was one of these psychological things. So I did a little talking. I said, why are we here? You know, stuff like that. Anyway, after 2 days of sitting around beating up on each other, the consultant gets active and he gives us a problem to solve. And so we solved the problem, and you have to get a spokesman. You have to pick a spokesman. So the people who were in sales ended up being picked as most of the spokespeople because they were supposed to be the most external. And the leaders, the consultant said, well, you know, when you get up there, your team is going to sit behind you, and you're going to make this presentation. And make sure you involve your team in any of the presentation you're doing. I said, okay. So they picked me, and I gave this presentation, and I kept looking back over my shoulder and whatever, and asking my team what to say and whatever. And after the presentation was over, the man who was in charge came over to me and he said, Mike, that's the worst presentation I've ever seen of any person in the 5 years that I've been doing this thing. And I said, really? Why? He said, well, you weren't yourself. You were trying to be what everybody was behind you. And that was the big lesson. And he said, you got to be yourself, no matter where it takes you, no matter what it is. Mm-hmm. So I've been myself. I think I'm the same person today. I'm the same person today that I was in 1962 or 3. And no matter what privileges I've had, or what, in every job I've taken, I think if you asked anybody who was with me in a peer level or without, they'd say the same thing. I was the same person all the way through. I'm humbled by my career, but the most important thing I ever did, I was telling Bob before, was when I founded the Asian American Hotel Association. I mean, all the money making and all that stuff pales by, all the big jobs, pales by comparison. Well, when I was president, it was the first big presidency that I had. And we had 250 hotels, and before I got there, the company was bought by a group out of New York City. And Dazen was a very southern company from Atlanta, Georgia, and this was the northern people who bought it, which a lot of people in Atlanta weren't happy about the fact that these, what they call, is a U.S. term called carpetbaggers. Carpetbaggers came out of the Civil War, when after the Civil War was over in the 1865 or so, people came from the north and they injected themselves into the southern culture. You wouldn't know that if you're not American, but it's part of the history. So they were carpetbaggers, came from New York, and they bought and they didn't have a chief operating officer, and after 6 months I came in as the chief operating officer and president, and they had 250 hotels that they owned, and they sold off 125 of them to many Asian Americans, at that time called Indians, from India, or they used to call them NRIs, non-resident Indians. Some people get mixed up because Native Americans were also called Indians, even though they weren't from India. That was because Columbus was supposed to go to India and never went there. But anyway, that's part of the history. So it's a learning thing. So anyway, so I get in there, and a guy in Chicago who was the head of the economy lodging group for I think Penelker Foster, one of the management consultant groups for the industry. I met with him, and he said, well, you're going to have to deal with all these Indian guys. And I said, okay. What's the problem? He says, well, you know, they don't run very good hotels. The hotels are dirty. They don't pay their bills, you know. I said, okay, what am I going to do? So I went and met some of these people, and I was very impressed with their commitments, very impressed with what they did. I did checks on their quality. I checked on their bill pan. Everything the guy said was wrong. Their hotels were no dirtier than anybody else's. They paid their bills no worse than anybody else's. They were hardworking. They ran very economically driven hotels. They weren't trained hotel people, but they were in the business. And what they did when they came over to the United States was some of them had a small amount of money. They all spoke English, of course, because the British did a good job with that. And when they came here, and they were all educated at that point. So the only thing they do is they bought a few small hotels, 40 rooms, 30 rooms, and they and their families ran them. And then eventually they got to the Days Inn level, which was a big uptick for them. And so I got very friendly with a couple of leaders of the community, and we sat and we talked, and they told me about the amount of discrimination that they've experienced. And they could not get mortgages, they could not get a franchise, they couldn't get insurance, they couldn't buy goods properly. There were billboards that were going up in their communities saying this, when they had hotels on the highway, saying this, don't go stay here because it isn't American owned. They weren't treated as Americans, and they were all citizens too, besides it. And I didn't think that was fair, I didn't think it was right, and we decided we were going to start an association called the Asian American Hotel Association. We started with 12 people. We ran a convention for 150 people, went around the country getting members. It was $25 to be a member. It's now, I think, a lot more. They have now about 18,000, 16,000 members. This was 1989. And they own probably 55 or 60% of the select service, they call it select service business now, which is Hampton Inns and Holiday Expresses, and they also own a lot of Marriotts, and they keep going up. They got Hiltons, they got everything else, and they're big owners now. So I was one of the founders, and to me, that's an important legacy for me in the terms of my work. I mean, I've turned around 5 businesses, 5 hotel businesses, to profitability and success. But at the end of the day, that's not a unique skill. Other people can do that, but I don't think there were many people that would have been able to pull off the Asian American Hotel Association. So to me, that's the legacy, the biggest legacy I have in the business.